You can learn a lot about a home by the way it looks at 7 o'clock in the morning. These days, many people wake up already behind. There are dishes in the sink from the night before, crumbs on the counter, a chair pulled out, a sweater tossed over the back of the sofa, maybe a school paper or grocery receipt still sitting where it was dropped. Before the coffee is even poured, the house is already asking for something. The day begins with a mess that never really ended. That was not always the case. In many 1950s homes, the house did not wake up in the same condition it had fallen asleep in. It woke up calmer. The kitchen looked ready to work. The table was usually cleared. The sink was empty or close to it. The main rooms had been put back into shape the night before, even in homes with children, even in homes with very little space, and even in homes where the woman running it was tired. That did not happen because she loved cleaning every second of the day. It happened because she understood something modern households often forget. A messy morning usually begins the night before. If old household wisdom like this still means something to you, subscribe and stay close. There is so much in these ordinary routines that families used to pass from one woman to another without ever writing it down. The 1950s housewife was not waiting for a free Saturday to get her life together. She was not letting the whole day pile up and hoping tomorrow's energy would somehow be better. Most of the time, the house stayed under control because it was guided back into order in small pieces every evening. What looks to us like discipline was often just rhythm. She did not need to wake up inspired. She needed to wake up to a house that had already been steadied. That is one of the biggest differences between then and now. Modern life gives us more ways to delay a mess. We have dishwashers, bigger fridges, more cabinets, larger kitchens, storage bins, baskets, shelves, and drawers for every category of life. And yet the mess often sits longer. A plate in the sink becomes a stack. A stack becomes a bad mood. A bad mood becomes the feeling that the whole house is slipping. Back then, homes were smaller, counters were limited, and a mess showed itself quickly. It could not hide. In a strange way, that forced a kind of honesty. The room had to be faced. In many homes, the evening reset started with dinner because dinner created the first real test. Once the meal was finished, a woman had a choice. She could sit down and leave the kitchen for later, or she could close that part of the day properly, before the tiredness got too deep. Many chose the second option, not because it was pleasant, but because they knew the cost of waking up to greasy pans, dried plates, and a table that still looked like yesterday. Morning work always feels heavier when it begins with unfinished business. The sink mattered more than people realize. A dirty sink has a way of making an entire kitchen feel lost. It does not matter if the rest of the room is fairly neat. If the sink is full, the kitchen feels unready. In the 1950s, many women understood that the sink was not just one chore. It was the signal for the whole room. Once it was emptied, washed down, and dried, the kitchen changed mood. It stopped looking like a place where the family had just finished using it, and started looking like a place prepared for the next meal. That small moment carried more power than modern people often expect. An empty sink gave the next morning a clean beginning. It made breakfast feel possible instead of annoying. It saved time, yes, but more than that, it protected the mind. Instead of starting the day with evidence that something had been neglected, the woman of the house started with one completed task already behind her. That changes the way a person moves. It changes the way the room feels. It even changes the way the family enters it. Do you remember a mother or grandmother who simply could not go to bed with dishes sitting in the sink? For a lot of women, that was not just a preference. It was a rule for keeping the next day from falling apart before it began. Of course, this did not mean every 1950s home looked perfect. It also does not mean life was easy. For many women, the same routines that kept a house calm also created real pressure. But the system itself was simple and effective. They did not think of it as a cleaning hack. They thought of it as closing the kitchen. That is different. A hack sounds optional. Closing the kitchen sounds final. And once the sink was cleared, the eye moved immediately to the rest of the room because a clean sink could only do so much if the counters were still crowded and the table was still holding the remains of the day. A 1950s housewife understood something that still holds true now. A room does not feel clean just because the dishes are done. It feels clean when the surfaces are ready to be used again. That is why the work did not stop at the sink. Once the plates were washed and the dish towel was hung up, attention moved to the places the eye would land first the next morning: the counters, the table, and the floor. The counter was not supposed to become a holding area for half the day. In many older homes, there was not enough room for that anyway. Kitchens were smaller, storage was tighter, and every bit of workspace mattered. A mixing bowl left out, a loaf of bread still open, a jar not put back, a stack of mail dropped near the phone. All of it stole space from tomorrow before tomorrow even began. Women in those homes did not always speak about this as a rule, but they lived by it. The counter had to go back to being a workspace before the day could end. That one habit prevented more disorder than people realize. When a counter stays crowded overnight, the morning begins with obstacles. There is nowhere to make toast, nowhere to butter bread, nowhere to set down a lunchbox, nowhere to place the coffee cups without first shifting yesterday's leftovers. The problem is not only visual, it is practical. Clutter turns simple motions into a chain of tiny frustrations. The old evening reset cut that chain before it had the chance to start. The kitchen table mattered just as much. In a lot of 1950s homes, the table was not decorative, it was used hard. It held dinner, homework, grocery lists, ironing piles, sewing baskets, and conversations that stretched past sunset. But before bed, it had to return to itself. A clear table meant breakfast could begin without delay. It meant a child could sit down with a bowl before school. It meant the day opened on a surface that was ready, not one still carrying the weight of the night before. That is part of what people miss when they talk about old homes feeling calmer. Calm was often built with these quiet resets. A woman was not trying to impress anyone at 10 o'clock at night. She was preparing the room so that nobody would have to fight it at 7 in the morning. The house did not feel peaceful by accident. It felt peaceful because the visible signs of interruption had been removed. The same thinking showed up in the smallest details. Chairs were pushed back in, crumbs were brushed off the table, bread was wrapped, leftovers were covered and put away. A dishcloth was spread neatly to dry. A child's book on the corner of the room might be carried back where it belonged. Shoes by the back door were straightened. None of those tasks sound dramatic on their own. That is exactly why they were effective. They were small enough to be done daily, and daily was what made the difference. The floor got the same kind of attention. Not a deep scrub every night, of course, but a quick return to order. In many homes, a broom came out after dinner almost without thinking. Crumbs under the table, bits near the stove, tracked in dirt by the door, these were handled before they spread. Women knew that a floor ignored for one night could feel twice as dirty by the next afternoon. A few minutes with a broom protected the whole room from that slow slide. Today, people often have more square footage, more cabinets, more baskets, and more ways to hide disorder. But hidden disorder still creates visible stress. A counter full of appliances, papers, vitamin bottles, and unopened packages may be common now, yet it quietly changes how a room feels. The same is true of a dining table that never really becomes a table because it is always holding something else. More storage has not always given modern homes more peace. Sometimes it has simply given clutter more places to wait. The old goal was not perfection. That matters. These women were not polishing every corner before bed or trying to make the house look untouched. They were restoring readiness. That is a different standard and a much wiser one. Readiness means the room can serve the family again in the morning without resistance. It means the first hour of the day is not spent undoing the last hour of the night. Would your morning feel different if the kitchen table was already clear before the coffee was made? A lot of people would say yes immediately because they know how much emotional weight sits in visible mess. One clear surface can change the mood of a room faster than almost anything else. And once the counters were wiped, the chairs tucked in, and the floor given its quick sweep, the room looked settled. But the evening routine was not only about making the house look calm. It was also about making sure the next morning would not begin with a rush of forgotten decisions. That was one of the quiet strengths of a 1950s home. The evening routine was not only about cleaning up what had already happened. It was also about getting ahead of what was coming next. A house could look neat on the surface and still wake up in confusion if nobody had thought about the morning. Women in that era often understood that order was not just about visible cleanliness. It was also about removing friction before the day began. In many homes, breakfast was not left as a problem for the half-awake version of tomorrow. A woman often knew before bed what the first meal would be, whether it was toast, cereal, oatmeal, eggs, or something simple already expected by the family. The table might not be fully set overnight, but the room was left ready for that work. The coffee pot was in place. The bread was where it should be. The dishes needed for the morning were easy to reach, because the kitchen had already been restored to working condition. Nothing had to be dug out from under yesterday. That same thinking stretched beyond breakfast. School clothes might be laid out. A husband's shirt might be checked to make sure it was clean and ready. Lunch items were often considered ahead of time because the morning hour moved fast once children were involved. A missing sock, an empty bread box, or a wrinkled blouse feels much worse when it is found at the exact moment everyone needs to leave. The evening routine protected against that kind of panic. Small checks at night prevented larger problems in the morning. This was especially important in a time when many homes had fewer extras. Families did not always keep deep backups of everything. If a shirt needed ironing, someone had to notice in time. If milk was running low, that mattered. If a child needed something signed or packed, there was a better chance it would be remembered. When the house was quiet, then when everyone was moving at once. Evening was often the only moment when the woman running the household could look ahead and ask a simple question. What will this house need when it wakes up? That question carried more of the home than people often saw. Order came partly from cleaning, yes, but also from remembering. Remembering who needed what had been used up, what had to be ready, what could not be left to chance. That kind of labor rarely announced itself. Nobody walked into the kitchen and praised the fact that the lunch paper was ready, or the school sweater had already been found, but the calm of the next morning rested on that invisible work. Laundry fit into this same pattern. In many modern homes, laundry disappears into baskets until it becomes a crisis. Then it returns all at once as stress. In the 1950s, many women tried to keep laundry moving before it reached that point, especially when children or work clothes were involved. That did not mean it was easy. It meant there was an effort to notice what tomorrow required before tomorrow began asking for it. A shirt on a hanger, socks paired, a dress looked over for a loose button. Those things saved time, but they also saved emotional energy. There was pressure in this system, and that should be said plainly. For many women, the burden of carrying tomorrow in their heads was heavy. The calm morning came at a cost, and that cost was often female attention, female memory, and female labor that few people named out loud. So the point is not to pretend this was a perfect arrangement. The point is to notice how much of a household's peace depended on one person thinking ahead with extraordinary consistency. Still, the method itself remains powerful. A home feels different when the next day has already been considered. Morning stops being a daily emergency. It becomes a sequence that has been quietly prepared. Coffee can be poured, breakfast can begin, shoes can be found, shirts can be worn. Children can leave without the whole house turning inside out in the process. When did families stop preparing mornings the night before and start trying to survive them in real time? That change may explain more modern stress than people realize. So much of what now feels like chaos is really delayed preparation catching up with the day. And once the practical needs of morning had been considered, there was still one last part of the old evening routine, something deeper than chores or planning. The house itself had to be closed down, not just cleaned, but settled. That final step may be the part modern life has lost most completely. The 1950s evening routine was not only a list of chores, it was a way of closing the house for the night. After the dishes were done, the counters cleared, the floor swept, and the next morning considered, there was still a feeling that the day needed to be put away properly. A home was not meant to drift into sleep still open, still scattered, still carrying every sign of the hours that had just passed through it. In many homes, this closing ritual happened almost without words. A woman moved from room to room doing small things that barely seemed important on their own. A lamp was switched off, curtains were drawn, a window was checked, the front door was locked, a blanket was folded over the arm of the sofa instead of left in a heap. A newspaper was stacked, a child's toy was lifted from the floor and placed where it belonged. An ashtray might be emptied. A cushion might be straightened with one hand as she passed by. None of this looked dramatic, but together it told the house that the day was over. That is part of why older homes so often felt different in the morning. They had been closed with intention. The family had not simply become tired and disappeared into bed, leaving the house to hold the shape of their exhaustion. Someone had taken a few final minutes to return the rooms to themselves. The living room became a living room again, not the remains of an evening. The kitchen became a kitchen again, not the remains of dinner. The house did not wake up burdened with the unfinished shape of the night before. The living room often mattered more than people now realize. It was the shared room, the room visitors might see, the room where the family sat together, read, listened to the radio, or watched television. Because it carried that shared identity, it was often straightened before bed. A tossed magazine, a cardigan over the chair, sewing left out in a basket, children's things underfoot. These might all be gathered into order before the lights went low. The room was not being prepared for strangers. It was being prepared for the family's own next morning. That old instinct is worth noticing. A room changes emotionally when it has been put back into shape. It does not just look tidier, it feels more trustworthy. You walk into it and sense that life is under control, at least a little. In the 1950s, many women understood this without having to explain it. Order was not only visual, it was emotional. A settled room gave people a steadier way to begin again the next day. Of course, none of this means the era was easy, and it does not mean every woman moved through her house each night with cheerful energy. Many were tired, many were carrying too much. For some, these routines were a source of pride. For others, they were one more standard to meet. The pressure was real, but the underlying principle still deserves attention. The day did not have to be allowed to spill fully into tomorrow. Some of it could be gently stopped at the threshold of night. That may be one reason so many people now feel that home life has no edges. We eat later, work later, scroll later, answer messages later, leave things where they fall, and tell ourselves we will deal with it in the morning. But morning arrives carrying all of it. Yesterday's dishes, yesterday's clutter, yesterday's indecision, yesterday's half-finished thoughts. The house becomes a storage place for delay, and the people inside it start to feel delayed too. The old answer was not more products. It was not a complicated system printed on labels or sorted into containers. It was a closing rhythm, a towel folded, a chair pushed in, a floor quickly swept, a room dimmed and restored. These were small acts, but they set a boundary. They told the home and the people in it that the day had reached its end. That is why the title of this story matters. 1950s Housewives did not wake up to a messy house because they were not really leaving the house unfinished at night. They were tired, yes. Busy, yes. Often under pressure, yes. But they understood that tomorrow feels very different when tonight has been properly closed. The calm morning was not magic. It was prepared. And maybe that is the lesson worth carrying forward, not the pressure. Not the idea that a woman must hold every corner of family life in her head alone, but the rhythm itself. The understanding that a home can be helped in small, steady ways before the mess hardens into stress. The answer may not be a new storage bin, a stronger cleaner, or a bigger kitchen. It may be a few quiet minutes at the end of the day when the sink is dry, the towel is folded, The table is clear, and one chair is pushed back into place for the morning that has not arrived yet. If this brought back a memory of your mother, your grandmother, or a home that always seemed ready for the day, subscribe and stay close. There is a lot more old household wisdom worth remembering, and sometimes it begins with something as simple as the way a woman left her kitchen before turning out the light.